is on Moodle, so you can see what the correct answers were if I didn't mark it on your quiz. And the blank is on Moodle, so you can redo it, to study for the exam, to help you enforce and reinforce your knowledge for the exam, which is on Monday. So this is our last day in this room before we're in this room for exam 1. You'll have an opportunity to talk to me in the lab, either tomorrow night or Friday morning, depending. The exam, I'll structure the exam in such a way that I think you can do it during the 3 hours that we're here, 2.5 hours. But we'll do it here. It's in class. Any questions about what's coming up? Okay, then let's get to work. Okay, so we're going to review some neuroanatomy. I'm a pretty firm believer that review, both in this room and at home, is an important way to put this information into your brain. Writing it out, relabeling things, making lists, telling stories, writing out the outline of the story. Repetition, at least for me, repetition is how I got this information into my brain in the first place and the reason it stays there. So let's play a game for a few minutes. Wake up. Okay, Logan, we're going to start over here. Logan. Lobe. Lobe. Temporal lobe. Zoe. Structure. Okay. Lobe. Frontal. Okay. Christian, I'm just going to do this while I have it in my head. Christian. Lobe.
Occipital.
Right. Okay, let's go to the midline. Abby. Structure.
The like groove or
No, the lump.
is that the post-central gyrus?
It's probably the pre-central gyrus. Okay, so giving you that, Jenna, what is this groove?
The central sulcus.
Right, and then Sam, the name of this structure?
Post-central gyrus.
Post-central gyrus. Motor cortex, we'll talk about that when we get to the motor section. Sensory cortex, we'll get to that when we get to the sensory section. Central sulcus. So pre-central gyrus is motor cortex, post-central gyrus is somatosensory, body sensation cortex. Okay. Challenge question, Meg. What would you, if you used anatomical names, what would you name this gyrus? It's not the cingulate. I haven't used this name in the room. You have to figure this out. It's got a logical name based on knowing what Logan told us the name of this structure was. Now I need an adjective. Where in the temporal gyrus, temporal lobe, is this gyrus? So you've got 2/3 of the answer correct.
Would it be superior?
Exactly. This is the superior temporal gyrus. Excellent. That's good problem solving. So even in anatomy, after you've memorized some things, you can figure some other things out. Okay, let's go to the midline sagittal section, which Thursday lab people will see in lab today, Thursday night. We're going to do this in lab Thursday night. Okay, who's Andrew? Nope, close, but not quite right. That's the cingulate gyrus. Now, Andrew. Corpus callosum. Michael, what's the name of the chamber behind this membrane?
Oh, is that the basal nuclei?
Nope, they're actually, you can't see them yet. It's the name of a chamber. So think of your heart. Think of your heart anatomy, and then apply it to this. Hannah, do you know the answer?
No, it's on like the tip of my tongue though.
Okay, Lindsay?
The lateral ventricle?
The lateral ventricle is the name of the chamber behind this membrane, which is called the septum pellucidum. Online students, can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up or something.
I can hear you when you're on this side of the room, Bob, but when you go over to the other board, I can't hear you as well.
That makes sense, and I apologize for that because I was using, yes, I will try to stay on this side of the room.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, where are we? Sarah, Medulla, Ramsey, Hans, Hannah, Sarah, Connor.
Is that the midbrain?
That is the midbrain, okay? Medulla oblongata pons midbrain. Okay, we're going to go back to Logan. This is midline, sagittal section. That's the thalamus. Okay, just a couple more. Zoe, what's the name of this sulcus right here? It's got a logical name based on this lobe and this lobe.
Is it the occipital?
Close. It's the parieto-occipital sulcus. And, okay, last one. What's the name of this sulcus right here? I mentioned it on Monday. Again, repetition is important. Abby, do you remember the name of this sulcus? Calcarine sulcus. This is where the visual cortex is. We'll talk about that when we talk about vision. Okay, so you can see what it takes to learn this stuff. Repetition, self-testing, quizzing yourself. If you just look it over, you can convince yourself that you know it all. But when you are forced to label something, you discover what you do and don't know. So, for example, we're not going to do this now, but you could label this image. Did I give you this image as a handout? Yeah. So you could take the handout and label this image. And not just restrict yourself to the labels that have letters. You could label the letters, and you could label the lines that are provided, at least some of them, and you could label additional things. So for example, on a test or on a quiz or on an exam, I could say, label 20 structures on this thing. Some of them are marked, and some of them are not. 20 labels is full credit. Something like that. That's a way that I do this. 20 would be a stretch on this one, but so I would give you a number that was challenging but not impossible. So we're not going to do this now. This is homework for learning neuroanatomy for the exam. Here's the same image we just looked at with some reminders of some names that you do want to know. But this is not all inclusive. So this is not a complete list. If you want to have a complete list, I believe your key concepts document has the complete list. And just so you know, I often say, well, label 10 things on this and extra credit for extra labels. So knowing more than the minimum can sometimes be to your advantage. I do that sometimes. I don't always do that. So read the instructions carefully because you don't want to waste time labeling things that aren't going to get you any additional credit. Each question will tell you whether there's any additional credit on that one or not. We can do the same thing here with these coronal sections. So let's do that. Who was last? Abby, I think you were last. Okay, so Meg, this lobe, temporal lobe. Christian, I'll get it, I hope. Christian, the name of this sulcus. It's the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is the sulcus that divides the temporal lobe from the, in this case, the frontal lobe. I'm giving you information about where this section is. That helps you. So I would not ask you to label the frontal lobe because that's given. And that would not get you extra credit if you labeled it. So given names don't help. Okay. Challenge question, Sam. What's the name of this gyrus? We didn't use it on Monday, but we used it just a few minutes ago. What's the name of this lobe?
Temporal.
What is the position of this gyrus of the temporal lobe? I think Meg got it before. Superior temporal gyrus. The auditory cortex, hearing cortex, is going to be there. Is there. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the auditory system. All right. Here's an easy one, Jenna. What's the name of this stuff?
White matter.
White matter. Why is it white? What's the name of the material that makes it white? Myelin. You knew that from the quiz, but that's why it's white. It's myelinated and unmyelinated axons are in the white matter. Okay, Andrew, what's this? Gray matter. What is in the gray matter? Neurons, but axons are part of neurons, and they're not very much there. So what parts of neurons are in the gray matter? Cell bodies and dendrites. And some axons, of course, because there's synapses in there. But that's where synapses are more than the axon fibers. Good. Okay, Olivia.
The corpus callosum.
That is the corpus callosum in a coronal section. So, just to be clear, corpus callosum in a sagittal section, cut it this way. Corpus callosum in a coronal section. Michael?
Would that be the lateral ventricle?
Those are the lateral ventricles. Okay, Sarah?
The septum pellucidum.
That's right, the septum pellucidum, the membrane that separates the two lateral ventricles. Okay, who's next? Lindsay. Think in 3 dimensions. So this thing is this thing that separates the two hemispheres. Hannah? Ramsey? Hannah? Longitudinal sulcus or longitudinal fissure separating the two hemispheres. All right, so we're done with this game. Oh, but I do want to introduce some new concepts. There's some new names. You have this handout in your handout. This, so you want to say that this is the thalamus, but it's not the thalamus because we are in front of the thalamus. We're anterior to the thalamus, so that gives you a hint it's not the thalamus. This and this are part of the striatum. Striatum is the name of, or basal nuclei, so it's got multiple names. Striatum, basal nuclei, and each of them has a specific name. Caudate, C-A-U-D-A-T-E, caudate nucleus. Putamen, P-U-T-A-M-E-N. And this structure here together is the globus, G-L-O-B-U-S, globus pallidus, P-A-L-L-I-D-U-S. We're going to see these. These are going to be important parts of motor and other processing, motor processing and other processing. Caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus. It's got two parts, but I don't care that you know which one is one and which one is two. This white matter right here has a name. It's called the internal capsule. This space right here has a name. It's called the third ventricle. So lateral ventricle, third ventricle. Things to know. Because I could throw this slide up and say, give me 10 labels. Okay, now we're another coronal section. Now we've moved from frontal to parietal. We've moved back a few centimeters. Now we are through the thalamus. So this is the next image on your handout. This is the thalamus. I don't think you would get credit for it if I gave you this kind of hint. Sarah, what's the name of these gyrus, this gyrus? The gyrus right above the corpus callosum. The gyrus right above the corpus callosum. The gyrus right above the corpus callosum. Cingulate gyrus, right? You have to think in 3 dimensions. It's not easy. Cingulate gyrus. We don't see the lateral ventricles here because we move behind it. But that's the third ventricle again. So you could take what you knew, some of what you knew from the previous slide. So, Andrew, I'll just pick on you. What's the name of this sulcus? The lateral sulcus in this image. Okay, I do want to point out something important. So what's the name of this lobe? Temporal lobe. What part of the temporal lobe is here? Medial temporal lobe. What is this structure right here in the medial temporal lobe? That's the hippocampus. You are using your hippocampus big time right now because the hippocampus is essential for the formation of memory. It's also essential for the recall of memory. It's not where memory is stored, but it's required to make and recall facts, declarative memories of names, places, things, events, sequences of events, stories. The hippocampus is required for you to make those stories, that knowledge, and to recall that knowledge. The knowledge is stored everywhere, all over the cortex. Memories are all in synapses all over the cortex. But the hippocampus is like the filing system. It tells the brain where to go to get a certain memory. So not a great analogy. We're going to talk about the hippocampus later today. Okay, so now we're going further back, behind the thalamus, temporal lobe, corpus callosum. Actually, here are the lateral ventricles again. So why don't we see them here? Well, they're here. They're just sort of small. You know, they're big, and then they small, and then they're big again as you go from front to back. Here's the hippocampus again in the medial temporal lobe. People with damage to their medial temporal lobe have a problem making and recalling memory. What's this structure right here? Michael, I'm just going to pick on you. Michael.
Would that be the cerebellum?
That's the cerebellum. I could point out another thing. So this is the lateral ventricle. This dark stuff, this dark material, has a name. It's called the choroid plexus. C-H-O-R-O-I-D, plexus, P-L-E-X-U-S. That's the material that lines the inside of the ventricles, especially the lateral ventricles, and makes cerebrospinal fluid. Its job is to make the fluid that bathes the brain. It's not neurons, it's an epithelium. Okay, so your job, your work to do is to do this with blanks repetitively until your hippocampus has worked and you have the knowledge in your brain that you can recall. I'm going to point out that white matter. So let's go back to here's an image that has corpus callosum. Well, I'm going back to the first one. Corpus callosum, internal capsule, then connected to so down here, that would be the medulla, and there's the pons, and there's the midbrain. I know it's hard to see, but here, let's dim the lights for this. This is an image that shows, using a really high-powered microscopic technique, that shows the fibers. It's called diffusion tensor imaging. You don't have to know that. But what's this? That's the corpus callosum in this kind of imaging. Here are fibers from the motor cortex. I think it's the motor cortex. I'm not sure because I don't know exactly where the section was taken. But let's just say this is from the motor cortex, and it's going to form the corticospinal tract, which is important for movement from the motor system, from the motor cortex down the spinal cord, and then motor neurons. So you can see here in this form of imaging the axons. That's what we're seeing here is axons. It's an amazing imaging modality. I will not use this, I think, on a quiz or an exam. But it's important that you be able to see, okay, this white matter that just looks like a glob is not a glob, it's fibers. Okay, so let's turn the brain over and look at it from the inferior perspective. We're looking at the bottom of the brain. So frontal lobe, cerebellum. The left side of the brain, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, looking at the brain from underneath. These are the cranial nerves. I will not ask you to memorize where on this image each cranial nerve is, although some of them are easy. Some of them are hard and some of them are easy. Like olfactory nerve is easy. Optic nerve is easy. Trigeminal nerve in a cartoon like this is pretty easy. The rest of them are hard. So I won't ask you to memorize that, this one is the abducens and this one is the oculomotor. It's not worth it. But I do want you to know their names and their functions. So functional neuroanatomy. Anatomy is the name and their functions. So here are the 12 cranial nerves. 12 cranial nerves. 12 cranial nerves. They have a name. Each of them has a name. There's a mnemonic device that I think works pretty well. If you memorize this sequence of words that make sense, old Oprah's occupation, tropical trips aboard famous vessels, glamorous vacations, accumulating hype. Sorry, Oprah. If you memorize that, you've got the first 2 or 3 letters of the cranial nerve. There are other mnemonics, but this one I like best because it gives you not just 1 letter, but 3 letters of the cranial nerve that it's helping you remember. So the olfactory nerve is carrying information from your nose about the things you're smelling to your brain. The optic nerve is carrying information from your eyes to your brain, telling you about the things that you see. Those are both sensory nerves. They don't have any motor function. They're input. Olfactory, smell input, or visual input. There's another mnemonic that helps you remember whether it's sensory, motor, or both. Some of them are mixed. So some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. So the first nerve, the olfactory nerve, is sensory only. The second nerve is optic nerve, is sensory only. The oculomotor and the trochlear are both motor nerves that control the movement of the eye. Oculomotor. Motor. The trigeminal nerve has both sensory and motor function. The abducens nerve is another nerve that controls eye movement. So these 3, oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, control the movement of your eyes. Motor. In between is trigeminal, which is both. Facial has both sensory and motor function. Vestibulocochlear. Balance and sound information from your ear. Balance, vestibulocochlear, from the cochlea of your ear. When we get to the auditory system, we're going to be referring to this cranial nerve. And it's purely sensory. So, olfactory, visual, facial sensation, hearing, and balance. Glossopharyngeal in the throat. Sensory and motor functions in the throat. Vagus nerve is very important. We're only going to we'll see that in a few minutes. It's got both sensory and motor function. Accessory and hypoglossal are accessory is the cranial nerve that controls movement of the shoulder. Motor nerves that control shoulder movement. Hypoglossal are tongue and throat. Motor. So I do want you, so one of the traditions of an anatomy and physiology course that's covering neuroanatomy is to learn these nerves. If you got out of this course and you didn't have to learn this, I would and then you went to graduate school or medical school, and you didn't know it, or you could say, oh, we never covered that. Your professors would say, what? What's wrong with the professor that taught you A&P at Irwin? I don't want to have that happen to me. So you are required to learn this because it's expected of me, and I'm expecting it of you. It's the way it is. Questions about anything we've covered so far? As you're preparing for the exam, if you have a question, do I need to know this? I'm okay with questions like that. I know some of your professors don't like that particular question. I'm okay with it because I know it's a big body of knowledge. There are things there are some details that I went into because I think they're cool and interesting, but I don't expect you to know. So I'm okay with the question, do we need to know that potassium concentration is high on the inside of the cell and low on the outside of the cell? And I would say, yeah, you need to know that. Do we need to know that the sodium-calcium exchanger exchanges 3 sodiums for 1 calcium? No, you don't have to know that. You used it, but that's not going to be a piece of information that I'm going to require you to memorize. Okay, so I'm happy to answer those questions. Those questions are easy for me. Email, answer, done. Questions? Okay. So now we're going to talk, so we're starting to move, we've already started to move from cellular neuroscience, neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, to systems neuroscience. The next section is going to be big time on systems, but I want to introduce the autonomic nervous system now. So let's look at this hierarchy. We've got the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to put that aside until the next section of the course. We've got the peripheral nervous system out in the periphery, arms, legs, face, whatever. We're going to talk about the sensory and the motor systems after the exam in the next section. So put this aside, but it's coming up. This is where we are. We're in a branch of the peripheral nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. This is something you don't think about. It happens automatically. It's incredibly important, but it happens in your background because it controls your heart rate, your breathing rate, your temperature. So it's internal homeostasis. And the sympathetic nervous system is important for arousal and action in a fight or flight type response. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system, settles you down, rest and digest. We talk about the parasympathetic nervous system a lot in the other A&P course when we talk about the digestive system. So here is a cartoon of the sympathetic nervous system. Printed it small, but you'll be able to get it on Moodle. What do I want you to know about the sympathetic nervous system? That it is the fight or flight response, increases your heart rate, increases your breathing rate. Do you think you need to digest food during fight or flight? No. So it turns off digestion. Do you think you need to be making urine during a fight or flight response? No. So it decreases the production of urine. Do you think you need to make saliva during a fight or flight response? No, your mouth gets dry if you're super stressed and nervous. So some of these, so the blue is showing sympathetic action, and some of them are increases, like increased heart rate, increased airflow to the lungs, increased respiratory frequency, dilates the pupils, and some of them are inhibitory, inhibits the production of saliva, inhibits motility and digestion in the digestive tract, inhibits the production of urine in the kidney. If you know sympathetic is fight or flight, and you know the sympathetic neurons go everywhere, you can figure out what they do based on what, logically. You don't need to be digesting food if you're running away from the bear. You don't need to be producing urine if you're running away from the bear. You need to be activating your heart, your lungs, and your muscles in order to run away from the bear. So I will not ask you to label a cartoon like this. The parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. Parasympathetic rest and digest, activates digestion, motility and digestion, controls the urinary bladder, reduces the heart rate, helps you slow things down, relax, increases the production of saliva as part of the digestive system. So that's the autonomic nervous system in a nutshell. What I want to do is cartoon the autonomic nervous system here. So this is information I do want you to know. So you don't have to think about the somatic nervous system right now. We're going to get to that in the motor system. Somatic, this is motor. So this is, let's get oriented here. This is supposed to be cell bodies and dendrites of nerves in your spinal cord. This is the spinal cord, gray matter spinal cord. These are axons of those nerves whose cell bodies are in the spinal cord. Or in the brain. Spinal, CNS, spinal cord or brain. Cell bodies, axons, and then synapses. Okay? So this is the motor system. So this is the neuromuscular synapse. We'll talk about that more in the motor system. Just put that aside for now. So here is let's do the parasympathetic nervous system. So we're talking about neurons from the brain and spinal cord making a synapse on the heart or in the lungs or in the salivary gland. By the way, you may notice a little V here, these little V's at the end of these lines. That's the universal symbol for synapse. This is a synapse to another neuron right here. This is a synapse to salivary gland. Okay? So these little V's are indicating synapse. Here's a synapse. So here's the first synapse here, and this is the second synapse. So solid lines are first, dotted lines are second. There's a two-step process in the autonomic nervous system. The first step, the first synapse of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is in ganglia near the target organ. This is a synapse in the heart, not on the heart muscle yet, in the cardiac ganglia. This is a synapse in the salivary ganglia. So the first synapse in the parasympathetic nervous system uses acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter and uses nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So is this an excitatory synapse? Yes. You know that the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor is permeable to sodium and potassium. You did this in the problem set. It caused depolarization. This is an excitatory synapse, a nicotinic excitatory synapse. Okay? So excitation here, action potentials, release of neurotransmitter, all that stuff we've talked about. The neurotransmitter that is released here is acetylcholine. Nicotinic receptors, depolarization, action potentials in the second neuron. Action potentials, neurotransmitter release. The second neuron, the second neuron, the second neuron, the second neuron releases acetylcholine. But here's the twist. The target in the parasympathetic nervous system is a muscarinic, not a nicotinic, muscarinic receptors that are coupled mostly to GI. Inhibitory. So this is typically, not always, but typically an inhibitory synapse. It inhibits, well, let's just leave it at that for now. Not always, because sometimes some of these muscarinic receptors were coupled to GQ. What does GQ do to its target cell? Increases calcium. Calcium can activate things. So I'm not asking you to memorize which of the muscarinic receptors are GI coupled and which of them are GQ coupled. I would tell you that if I wanted you to solve the problem. But I would not tell you that this is a nicotinic receptor because they're all nicotinic receptors. So you need to know that acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, nicotinic excitatory receptors, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, muscarinic receptors, which can either be excitatory GQ coupled or inhibitory GI coupled. That's the parasympathetic nervous system. Questions? Bronson.
So the spinal cord is surrounded by the vertebrates, right?
Yes.
So how do these synapses get out of the vertebrae? Do they pass through the discs?
So here's the gray matter. The output is in nerves that comes out of the spinal cord and actually goes between the bones. The bones have gaps, and the nerves go between the bones, and then form a nerve and goes to the target organ. Good? Yeah. Let's transition to the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, so we're talking now about the fight or flight response. The first neuron is in the spinal cord and makes a synapse in a ganglion that is usually near the spinal cord. So the first neuron is actually pretty short, from the spinal cord to ganglia near the spinal cord. So that's what they're cartooning here. The first neuron, action potentials, release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is acetylcholine again. Yay, easy. Nicotinic receptors. Yay, easy. We already did that. Action potentials in the secondary neuron, which go, well, let's just be up here. First neuron, acetylcholine, nicotinic receptors, action potentials to the target, to the heart, to the lungs. Let's just focus on those for a minute. Action potentials, release of neurotransmitter by the same mechanisms. Apply your calcium channel mechanism. The neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. So we now have a new neurotransmitter. And acetylcholine all the way until here. Norepinephrine interacts with adrenergic receptors. You can predict, are they all excitatory? No, some of them are excitatory, and some of them are inhibitory. How? Receptor. Some of them are GS, S as in stimulatory coupled, and some of them are GI or GQ coupled, and we'll see why GQ can sometimes be inhibitory later on. It depends on, just like this depended on the muscarinic receptor type, this depends on the adrenergic receptor type. The receptor in the heart is stimulatory. The receptor in the gut is inhibitory. That's the sympathetic nervous system. Now, when we get to endocrine, there is going to be a branch of the sympathetic nervous system that is endocrine, and it depends on the same kind of synapse here, but instead of using a neuron, it uses a blood vessel to transport adrenaline, epinephrine, to the target. So we're going to leave this aside until we get to the endocrine section of the course. We're going to leave this aside until we get to the motor section of the course, and all you have to be able to do is understand this and this. Oh, yeah, right. That's all you have to do. So what you might want to do, I didn't do this for you, but what you might want to do is print this out large enough to actually label. Let's take some white out, or just cross out the names of everything. Cross everything out, put it aside so you forget what you just crossed out. Come back to it an hour later and try to label it. Try to remember that this is acetylcholine, and this is acetylcholine, and this is nicotinic, and this is nicotinic. This is excitatory, this is excitatory. This is acetylcholine, but sometimes inhibitory. This is norepinephrine, and sometimes excitatory and sometimes inhibitory. Labeling, outlining, telling the story, that's how this stuff gets into your brain so that you can tell me your knowledge on an exam. I know I sound like I'm repetitious. So, this was the question that Ramsey asked about how do the nerves get from the spinal cord out. It's between the bones of the spine. There are sections of the spinal cord: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal. I do want you to know the names of those sections of the spinal cord in order. Cervical, thorax, in the chest, lumbar, lower back. You've probably already heard that word. Lumbar spinal. Sacral is sort of the base of the spinal cord. You can feel it, right? Your tailbone. Well, that sacral and coccygeal are kind of fused, and they're in your tailbone. You don't have tails, but you do have a tailbone. Some classes would ask you to memorize that there are 7 cervical sections and there are 12 thoracic. I'm not going to do that. So the numbers of sections you don't have to memorize. You just have to memorize the name in order. Which one is above which and which one is below which. Let's take a break. Let's take a good 5 to 10 minute break. So feel free to move around, label your slides, ask me questions. We'll take a break now.